Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, China, the Strategy of Denial, organized by the Council on Geostrategy, the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom, as well as other free and open nations, more united, stronger, and greener. The rise of the People's Republic of China and the surrounding Indo-Pacific region has altered the global balance of power. The United Kingdom's Integrated Review, published last year in March, identified the PRC as a systemic competitor. The United States National Defense Strategy back in 2018 called the interstate strategic competition the primary concern in US national security and named the PRC as a strategic competitor. In his latest book, The Strategy of Denial, Elbridge Colby, the lead architect of the 2018 National Defense Strategy in the United States, lays out how America's defense must change to address the PRC's growing power and ambition. Based firmly in the realist tradition but deeply engaged in current policy, this book offers a clear framework for what the US goals in confronting the PRC must be, how its military strategy must change, how it must prioritize these goals over its lesser interests, and how the US can prepare to win a war with the PRC that it cannot afford to lose, or more precisely, in order to deter that war from happening. Today, we have a wonderful opportunity to discuss the New Year's book by Elbridge Colby with the author himself, and we're also absolutely delighted to be joined by two other distinguished panelists and members of Parliament, the Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood and Alicia Kearns. Elbridge Colby is co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. From 2018 to 2019, he was the director of the defense program at the Center for New American Security, where he led the center's work on defense issues and served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the department's preeminent strategic planning guidance, the 2018 National Defense Strategy. He's also the author of The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, which the Wall Street Journal selected as one of the top books of 2021. We're also absolutely delighted to be joined by the Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood, who is the chairman of the Defence Select Committee at the House of Commons and also our Advisory Council member. The Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood is a member of Parliament for Bournemouth East, and he currently serves, as mentioned, as the chair of the Defence Select Committee in the House of Commons. He was Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Africa at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 2016 to 2017, and also served as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Defence, Veterans, Reserves and Personnel at the Ministry of Defence from 2017 to 2019. He's an active Army reservist. And we are also absolutely delighted to be joined by Alicia Kearns, who's a member of Foreign Affairs Select Committee at the House of Commons and a member of Parliament for Rutland and Melton since 2019. She studied social and political sciences at Fitzwilliam College in Cambridge, graduating back in 2009. Alicia also previously worked in communication roles at the Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Justice, and at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. She has been a member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee since March 2020. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. Our panelists will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes each. And in the second half of our hour, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. We will start with Elbridge Colby, followed by Alicia Kearns and by Tobias Ellwood. You can ask your questions during the whole course of the event, but please do make sure to indicate your name, your affiliation and organization, and to whom you are addressing your question. So without any further delay, Elbridge, please, the floor is yours, and we're absolutely delighted to be joined by you today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Victoria, and thanks to the Council on Geostrategy for this really kind invitation and opportunity to talk about my book and to talk about it with two such distinguished members of Parliament. Really looking forward to their engagement and to the discussion with the audience. I will say, I've been promoting the book in the United States, but now I'm starting to move outwards, and of course, starting with the United Kingdom, our close ally, the special relationship, and it's really a pleasure to be able to do that with the Council on Geostrategy, as you said, one of the new really important think tanks that are trying to think about these geostrategic implications in just the way that I am, at least trying to grapple with the same kind of problem. So it's really a pleasure. I wrote this book, The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, based on my experience in the Pentagon. It's not an experiential book, it's a strategic book, but basically convinced that we, the United States, and I think by extension our allies, have not yet sufficiently grappled with the fundamental geopolitical changes that Victoria alluded to, and that our defense strategy has still not caught up with that. And in the book, what I really tried to do is offer a strategic framework, a kind of a deductive framework more than anything else, for with which we can grapple with the fundamental reality of what the economists call scarcity, where in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States, along with the UK and a few others, maybe Australia, could deal with the potential threats to our sort of alliance system, or whatever you want to call it, basically on our own. I mean, be nice to have some German soldiers or Italian soldiers or what have you along, but basically we could do things pretty much by ourselves. And that was instantiated in the American Defense Planning Standard of being able to fight two large regional wars at the same time. Well, that world is gone. We are now in a situation in which we don't have, certainly we, the United States alone, as strong as we are, we do not have the power to deal with all the potential threats that we face, essentially unilaterally. And why is that? Well, above all, that's the rise of China. And that's pretty straightforward, as Napoleon is supposed to have said, and Xi Jinping likes to quote, when China rises, the world will quake. So we're quaking, but at the same time, there's also Russia, of course, reminding us of their presence and interests every day now. There's Iran, there's North Korea, there's terrorists, and you could, John Bolton might include Venezuela, or you name it. So there's the range of potential threats are way above our power resources to deal with that, and that's, unfortunately, we still, I think, haven't fully grappled with that. But that's sort of that's the statement of the problem. That's the recognition that you have a drinking problem. But what do you do about it? And so that's what in this kind of context, a strategy is really important. And by a strategy, I don't mean like a kind of Baroque, sort of very, clever kind of one step after another thing, but rather a framework for making choices and optimizing the allocation of resources and risk in this condition of scarcity. And that's what this book is about. So what is a strategy of denial? Well, the first meaning of denial is we got to get over the denial of reality, of geopolitics, of geostrategy, to use your term, that has essentially characterized American, and I think it's fair to say a lot of European thinking about international politics since the end of the Cold War. Okay. Secondly, we need to have, in a sense, we haven't had to think that hard about defense strategy since the end of the Cold War, because our resources have so outpaced the potential threats. So we could talk about foreign policy, and we would just throw our resources at Iran or North Korea or what have you in the 2000s or 1990s, maybe unwisely in a lot of cases, but we could, from a defense planning point of view, we could do that. That's no longer the case. We have to make choices. And in that context, we should have a clear sense of what our overarching geopolitical strategy is, our grand strategy is. And for the United States, I go back, I'm a kind of a conservative realist, you could say. I go back to first principles. The purpose of a Republican government, or a parliamentary government, is to serve the interests of its citizenry. In an enlightened way, yes, but it should be at least some way connected to their self-interest. And in that context, our basic goal is to protect the American people's security, prosperity, and liberty. The most serious, plausible danger to that is a country in the international system becoming so powerful that it could exercise that leverage over our national life and undermine it. And of course, I think that's a similar, I would imagine that, and I don't presume to say, but I would imagine there's a similar logic for Britain or for really any other country that we're linked with. And in that context, let's think about the regions of the world, because the international power, which is basically a derivative of international wealth and economic development, is basically concentrated. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's how it is and has been, and is very likely to continue to be. And there's basically a couple of key regions: East and sort of South and Southeast Asia, Europe, North America, and in a very concentrated way, the Persian Gulf. Those are the important regions of the world. And by far the most important of these going forward is Asia, which will be more than 50% of global GDP in the future. In fact, Borrell, the EU Foreign Policy Supremo, mentioned actually a couple of days ago or weeks ago that Europe will shrink to be about 10% of GDP, global GDP, in 20 years. So, Asia is the most important. Europe is also particularly important, and then North America, but essentially because of the United States itself. And in that context, so Asia is the most important region. And where is the potential regional dominant power that could try to pretend to gain a regionally dominant position and exercise it over our national life? China. That's the only one. I mean, it's about our size for the first time in the international system. Since the late 19th century, the United States is not clearly the largest economy in the world. China is also in the running, depending on how you measure it. So China in Asia is by far the most serious danger of that happening. And I mean, I think we can see it all happening before our eyes. Just ask the Indians or the Australians, let alone the Taiwanese or the Japanese or something. Okay, so that's got to be our goal. Everything else needs to follow that. Churchill said a lot of things over his career, but one of the ones I like from him is if you get things right in the decisive theater, you can put everything right again afterwards. And that's the logic that I pursue. In that context, okay, that's our overall geopolitical goal of denial. Then there's, breaking it down, there's a military strategy of denial for the United States, which guides not only our own planning, but how we should think about our allies and partners. And that's what I obviously like to touch on here in particular. And in that context, we do need to worry about the military dimension. In fact, we need to worry about it more than anything else. Military force is not the only thing. In fact, in an ideal world, like law and order, you can make it marginal if you take care of it correctly, just like the police in a safe neighborhood. But if you don't have it right, it's going to be dominant. If you want to start a business in a neighborhood and the neighborhood's dangerous, that's all you're going to worry about. Same in international politics. And the particular problem is that, yes, China has a lot of sources of leverage in its quiver. But actually, I think paradoxically, it's finding the limits, as we have found the limits of economic sanctions and leverage. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal about even the limits it's facing, say, vis-a-vis Kenya, in a pretty underdeveloped country, let alone Australia or India, where its attempts to use that leverage has essentially backfired. Now, that's good at one level, but it also is going to increase the allure of military force for China to employ. And China has built a military and is building a military, not to defend itself, but to project dominant military power first throughout its own region and then the world. I mean, it's no longer speculative. They're exploring a base in Equatorial Guinea, for God's sake. I mean, and that's in public. I mean, that's the Biden administration has publicized that. Imagine what else they're thinking about. And in that context, what do we need to worry about? Well, my real argument here is the American defense establishment needs to worry about China's best strategy. And that's particularly critical because China's best strategy is not to precipitate World War III Hitler style. Didn't work out for Hitler, didn't work out for anybody else, certainly didn't work out for the German people. I don't think that's what they want. They know that our goal is to deny them regional hegemony, which is very advantageous. It's a great situation if you can get it. Great powers almost always go for it, or pretty much always do go for it at some level, or a hegemonic position over a large market area. The British Empire would be an example of that. The way we block it is pretty straightforward. It's a balancing coalition. I call it an anti-hegemonic coalition. In fact, you can see it coming together. It's not an Asian NATO. I don't think an Asian NATO is necessary. And frankly, it's probably not desirable. Happy to go into that. But the Japanese-Australian alliance agreement or uptick that you just saw in the news is an example of that. Obviously, the Quad, AUKUS, et cetera, are examples of this anti-hegemonic coalition forming, particularly in Asia. And basically, if that continues, China will be prevented from being in a dominant position. The countries will work well enough together to be able to block Beijing from attaining that goal. Now, okay, China can let that happen. Xi Jinping doesn't seem like the kind of guy who is likely to let that happen, or at least sit quietly by as it does. So the fact that there's a coalition forming should reassure us, but we shouldn't be taking victory laps because it actually intensifies the danger in some respects, or in key respects, I would say. And in this context, if China is not as likely to be able to leverage its economic capacity, they may look to the military. And what China's goal, its best strategy, in my view, is what I call the focused and sequential strategy. Basically, think a couple of short, sharp wars designed to collapse this anti-hegemonic coalition and achieve what you could think of as a systemic effect on the international system without a systemic war. And my favorite example of this turned out badly for all of us in the end, but what is the Wars of German Unification, 1864 to 1871, a series of short, sharp wars that resulted in a fundamental transformational systemic effect in what was then the key theater of the world, Europe. That's what we need to worry about. And in particular, what we need to worry about from a defense planning point of view, us, the United States, is China going after a US ally, because the center of gravity of this anti-hegemonic coalition is America, not because we're so great, but we're so strong. Nobody else can stand up to China alone. We have to be the leader in Asia. If they don't, countries are going to be incentivized to cut a deal with Beijing because they don't want to be exposed. As Lee Kuan Yew said about Thailand, they bend before the wind blows, but it's not, the Thais are not the only ones who you could talk about that from. Frankly, you could say that about Singapore right now. So I think that's the danger we need to look at. And that brings me to my deep concern about Taiwan, because Taiwan is a critical part, in my view, in practice of this US alliance network that undergirds this anti-hegemonic coalition. Obviously, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, others. But what we need to worry about is they're kind of using military force to isolate and then salami slice that coalition and then cause a run on the bank, essentially, because people will say, well, Taiwan got fried, I'm next. And I don't believe the Americans. They flap their gums, they say nice things, but at the end of the day, they're going to leave me out to dry. So bottom line, that really requires that we have a denial defense. Our goal is to deny China's ability to subordinate our allies within the coalition. At the end of the day, think Britain 1940. As Dowding said at the time, my goal was not to win the war finally and march on Berlin. My goal was to defeat the invasion. That's the minimum standard. And that's what we need to be able to provide for Taiwan, because if we can get it right for Taiwan, we can get everything right afterwards. Now, the critical point for the United Kingdom is that is exceptionally hard. It's a low political standard at the end of the day, but given how strong and focused China is, it's incredibly demanding, and we are not in a good position. And as senior US military officers and analysts have repeatedly said with a lot of credibility, we're losing the war games that we play. Now, we can fix that. That's the part that people often don't mention about these Taiwan war games, is we know how to do better, but we're not doing that quickly and effectively enough. Basically, I think I'm now at the point where I think we're actually going to start to need to just drop other commitments, certainly in the Middle East, and substantially draw down in Europe. And that's the reality. And I think this administration is not accurately conveying to Europeans the reality. In fact, it's talking about increasing the US force posture in Europe, which is actually 180 from where we need to be going. I don't think it's not helping Europeans, because this situation is going to become urgent. And if we neglect it, there will be an East of Aden moment with the United States, where the Chinese will press and there will be a disaster, and we will essentially have to make dramatic, unwise, or dramatic and excessive shifts, rather than doing it sort of gradually and more in concert with our allies. So what I'm really hoping the conversation I'm hoping to spur, and certainly above all in the United Kingdom, but throughout Europe, is a reckoning with this reality, because we do have a Russia problem, of course. We do have an Iran and terrorism problem, but the United States is going to play much less of a role in those situations. My supposition, my strategy, I should say, for how we deal with this is empowering and building up allies much more, and pressing them, particularly in the case of Germany and a few others, to step up. And in Europe, the Europeans should take the bulk of the conventional defense against Russia over time. This is the original vision of NATO that Eisenhower and Marshall had. I think it's consistent. That's the only way it's going to last, in a sense. And in the Middle East, a similar, the US is going to have to back the Abraham coalition. Maybe UK and others can play a role, France. But I think that's where we need to be having the debate. I actually don't see that debate happening right now. There's a lot of loose talk about what we can do in Ukraine. I mean, the reality is, just to be very clear, if we fight a war with Russia and Ukraine, we're going to be totally vulnerable in Asia. And if I were China, I don't know why I would sit by. I mean, that's self-defeating. So that's the world that we're living in. If we reckon with this reality together, I think we'll be better off. But with that, look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Elbridge, for your speech. And I would like now to ask Mr. Ellwood to give his presentation. Thank you.
Just grab the mute switch here. Firstly, thank you very much to Victoria for inviting me to the Council of Geostrategy once again, and real pleasure to be sharing the platform with somebody who I absolutely admire. Elbridge, great to see you, and the plethora of books that you've written on strategy and on China and so forth. I would certainly encourage everybody to delve into these, because it is the absence of strategy, I think, in today's day and age, that is the wider concern. Not China, park that for a bit, park Russia, park Iran. It's just understanding the purpose and importance of strategy and tactics. And you could apply that to COVID, you could apply that to the alliance of NATO, you could apply that to Afghanistan, and of course to our big competitors as well. So delighted to be here today to discussing and focusing on China. Eldridge touched on the fact that actually it's Russia that's probably keeping us awake at night at the moment, as NATO goes about its business in working out how to respond to Russia's adventurism. Just to touch on that, it's just worth commenting. It's a reflection, perhaps, just how weak and risk averse the West has become. I argued when we had a debate on Afghanistan that our departure from there could mark the high tide mark of Western post-war liberalism. The authoritarianism is on the rise across the world. I visited Kazakhstan when I was a minister, and the region around there, again, a part of the world perhaps people aren't too familiar with, and it's certainly not like Borat and all those films. And whenever you need an enemy, it's normally a Stan that's produced in the Hollywood films. Far from it. This is like the Gulf was in the 30s, and I saw them on the precipice of wanting to rid themselves from the long arm, the long shadow of Moscow. And here was the people rising up, but straight away Russia chose the opportunity to move its troops in to reconfirm control, its sphere of influence. And that's what this is all about. And that leads nicely into what China is doing. It has absolutely a strategy to expand its sphere of influence, to feed the economic requirements, and it knows it can do that, taking advantage of weak international rules, which we've not done enough to perhaps stand up to. There was this assumption perhaps that they would mature into some global citizen on the international stage, a beacon of democracy, following where the Soviet Union went and then didn't go. But nevertheless, clearly they've read their Sun Tzu and worked out that actually there is a war to be had without fighting, and using its economic clout, it's done an incredible job. I absolutely believe that we're so in denial that we are sliding towards the world's splinter into two spheres of competing influence, of many countries being almost forced or obliged to look one way or another. And to some degree, that's already happening across across Africa and so forth. Countries getting tied up into China's One Belt, One Road programs, very, very attractive from that perspective until you start having to pay the bills back. Getting tied up into their technological capabilities, Huawei and so forth, which are almost gifted to them, not realizing there's an awful lot of small print design behind there. And of course, military capabilities as well. You sign up to support mechanisms and so forth. What it does is create bonds with countries that were once our friends, and then over time, and we're talking years, decades, and this is how China thinks. They think in the long term. They want to get all this done by 2049, which of course is that key date for them. They're in no rush to go anywhere. It's slowly but surely. All this talk of Taiwan and so forth is whilst we're getting very het up and concerned about it, they're just going to take the long road getting there, but knowing that they actually will get there. Having said that, if I was an adversary across the world, potentially even China as well, you think about how the West is currently distracted by COVID. We're distracted by Russia right now as well. We're distracted by each other because relationships, let's say Brexit and so forth. If China did want to do something a little bit, interesting, probably in the next sort of couple of weeks would be a great time to do it because everybody's looking the other way. But we'll wait to see what happens there. But my concern is that we are sliding towards actually a Cold War 2, but not in build-up of military might as we saw in the first Cold War. There were no troops involved as such like that or nuclear weapons. From this perspective, the Cold War will be, as I say, sliding towards countries being forced to look one way or another. And China is winning that, is be able to neutralizing countries by ensnaring them into long-term debt, by controlling states, by owning their data. And data is going to perhaps overshadow terrain as being more and more critical. And of course, by paralyzing the international apparatus, the very organizations that we normally look to actually hold errant nations to account. The UN is unable to do its work because of the veto. The World Trade Organization isn't able to function as it should do. And on top of that, we are bumping into constant competition in the form of engagement threats, which are beneath the threshold which would warrant a normal military response. And by that I mean, we know stealing of intellectual property, cyber attacks and so forth. That is where the character of conflict is going. And we are punished by our very openness. The fact that we do have an open society and we have easily to be accessed, unlike China, it means we're easier to hack, we're easier to infiltrate, we're easier to cause economic harm, we're easier to sow social discord through bot farms and so forth, sending messaging out which perhaps might knock public opinion one way or another. And we've not caught up with the fast-changing world in the way that we should do. There are almost too many plates spinning for us to actually recognize how the West actually needs to work together. The West, in my view, is shrinking. It's actually getting smaller. And we've got some big questions to ask ourselves as to how we do actually defend those values. My answer to that, and I hope it'll provoke perhaps a bit of thought in discussion, is the one organization that you could lean on could be the G7, because when you have the G7 and then you add on countries like South Africa, Australia, and Korea, you end up with half the world's GDP. That's not a bad place to start then saying, let's have some trade and security rules that we can agree with. And then you then invite other organizations which would be minded to support, such as the EU, maybe the Commonwealth and so forth, to say, join our club, but only if you operate under these international standards. And so we retain or re-establish higher standards of which we can actually work with, rather than, as I say, allowing China or indeed other countries then get away with what they're doing, which is take advantage of bending and exploiting weakened international rules themselves. So there's an awful lot of work to do. There requires some leadership. You would normally look to the United States for this. I actually had big sort of aspirations, was enthused when Donald Trump, was defeated. Whilst he may have woken us up to what China was up to, he didn't do much to rally consensus in the West. In fact, John Bolton was mentioned by Elbridge. I think John actually confirmed that Donald Trump almost pulled us out of NATO, which wouldn't have been very helpful for that particular alliance. But with Biden coming in, there was this America is back initial approach. But as we see, and Eldridge can comment on this further, it does seem that America is so paralyzed itself by internal domestic tensions. It's, of course, focusing the minds of the White House and indeed Congress. And that's all, again, being taken advantage of by our adversaries. Therefore, you could turn to Britain to say, let us step up to the plate. Let us, fill that vacuum of international leadership. But as I'm sure Alicia will confirm too, we've got our own little distractions going on here in the UK too, not least today of all days as well. So lots to do. I think we need to make more noise about it, which is why books such as Eldridge has now come out with, I hope will educate and advance people's thinking and recognize and energize us to actually step forward and recognize perhaps where the dangerous trajectory of where our world is now going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. And we are now joined by Alicia Kearns. She would like to give very brief remarks before moving straight into Q&A session, because we have only 30 minutes left for our discussion with our attendees. So Alicia, the floor is yours for your brief remarks, and then we'll move straight into the Q&A. But I would also like to remind all our attendees to start posing their questions now, but please also indicate your organization and your role. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that I'm slightly late. It's a very quiet day in British politics, and I had a Prime Minister's question. Look, I'll keep my comments very brief because you've heard already from two excellent speakers, and obviously I wouldn't want to repeat them, having not been able to hear all of it. We all recognise that the challenge of the Chinese Communist Party is systemic, and it shows no sign of dissipating in any form. We can't ignore it, which is often what I would advocate when it comes to Russia. We definitely can't play nicely, so we have to work to essentially curb the worst excesses of its behaviours. We need to make sure we don't push into outright provocation, and we don't confront them in a way that I think is unlikely to end well for anyone. But I also don't want to see us to go into Cold War. And I think when I look at how we should be responding to China, it falls into a couple of categories. So first, what I like to call a constellation of alliances. We have to focus on making sure that we have a constellation of different alliances across the world in different places that counteract those activities that China is taking and undertaking in different parts of the world. So we've seen AUKUS, which is a fundamentally good thing, and that is a very powerful thing. We have NATO, which will continue to be a fundamental support mechanism, but isn't really to do with China, but we should all be very alive to the risks and where China starts intervening in NATO's backyard. Then we should look at the G7, as Tobias rightly mentioned, that is a key function. region. And we should support and look at where other countries like Japan and Australia recently are looking at building their own alliances and how we support and work around them. We've spoken obviously about America, and that's obviously very much what Elbridge's book looks at. America is, like the rest of the world, waking up to the challenge of China, and it is recommitting to the region, or at least so it says, but those, I experience them more as words rather than reality at the moment. And I think none of us believe that we can truly rely on China to be a strong and fervent partner where it comes to this. For example, only this week on Russia, we've seen them agree to split the US off from NATO, which is a fundamentally dangerous thing to do. We should be providing united front, US and NATO together as one, all allies. So I remain fundamentally concerned about the ability of America to really step up to the plate. On the European Union, we've seen them dither, which is another demonstration of why extricating ourselves and allowing us to create our own foreign policy was the right thing. Underneath those alliances that need to map out across the world, and they shouldn't just be military alliances. I think we need to look at aid alliances. So how do we work to counter the Belt and Road Initiative fundamentally, because we can and we should. And so for the UK, the Commonwealth is one of those key alliances where we can work with our historical friends and allies and offer an alternative, a meaningful alternative to China. So I want to see us look at the defence realm, at the aid realm. I want us to look at the political realm and make sure we're creating a constellation of all those different types of alliances to counteract China. The next thing we need to look at, which obviously there's been a lot of discussion about already in the call, is defensive and offensive capabilities. We have to stop just talking about how China is spending so much money, how China is investing so well, and almost setting ourselves up to suggest that China is infinitely impossible to beat. They are not in a place where they can launch a world hegemony. And like Russia, so often we talk about how Russia is so strategic. Russia is so careful in what they plan and what they do in their foreign policy and their military activities. But actually with Russia, so often you find they throw 100 things at the wall, they see what sticks, and then they invest in it. Now, China's a very different beast because they have time, they're not in a rush, they've got the money, and they've got the populations. We need to be making sure that as a country, we invest in our offensive capabilities, but also our defensive capabilities on hybrid warfare, because as Tobias said, that is the type of warfare we are facing. It is nothing new, and it shouldn't surprise us, this behaviour, but it is a bulwark of their activity, and it's a lot easier for authoritarian states. And that is, I think, where one of the fundamental risks comes from, which is the fact that China has, as an authoritarian state, can control every single lever of their government and almost every lever of their society to work towards the strategic outcome they're trying to secure. So they are far more effective at infiltrating universities, research facilities, attacking infrastructure, economic espionage, cyber attacks, laws and efforts to muzzle opponents, mass surveillance, censorship, disinformation, undermining democratic structures, all we're seeing in terms of their wolf warrior mentality. But we have to stop just sitting around and saying, their goodness, that's so awful what they're doing, and criticizing them. We need to get real and start building those defenses, inoculating our public and stop infantilizing the public when it comes to defense and security, and teaching them about hybrid warfare and the type of threats we face. I fundamentally believe that the UK is willing to chart an independent, clear-eyed course, and we don't need to face the challenge alone. And that's really what Elbridge is looking at in terms of, US stands in the way of China when it comes to power in Asia, and they're trying to thwart China's hegemony. The UK is the fundamental partner in this, as we've seen with AUKUS. But our Five Eyes relationship, AUKUS, our relationship with the Five Nations, this is something we can really strengthen the five power defence arrangements. We can really strengthen our constellation of alliances, and that will be the fundamental that allows us to act in a swift, agile and sensible way, because also we have to recognise that it is their backyards, not ours. So whilst I think the UK has a fundamental duty, it is not our backyard, and therefore we must see ourselves as, yes, standing strong, but in the support of our allies. And so I'm hoping that the new government China strategy, which will be coming forward, I hope it will be public in the next few months, will very much look at this focus on 1, constellation of alliances, 2, defensive and offensive capabilities, 3, hybrid warfare, but finally deterrence diplomacy, because I believe that this is the century of deterrence diplomacy, where we have to prove, because we failed in the last one, that we can use diplomacy effectively to prevent conflict before it happens. I hope that gives a few interesting thoughts to kick off the conversation, and looking forward to answering people's questions.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you once again, all the panelists for their important contributions. So let's start our Q&A session. And I have a very quick question I would like to ask. Elbridge, how, in your view, does Britain, as the US most powerful and important ally, fit into the strategy of denial? Could you please elaborate a bit more on this point? Thank you.
Sure. That's a very interesting. I have a number of reactions to what's been said. I think this is very useful. I guess, and illuminating. I think the point I would really stress in light of the comments is, my book hopefully is useful as a kind of a framework for collective action. That's what I really hope, is that we together can look at the world in a fairly similar way and try to do so together, particularly with our close allies like the United Kingdom. But at a minimum, I think my book hopefully gives you a sort of a leading indicator of where the US foreign policy discussion is likely to go. So I have a sharper view than many, but my book hasn't, as far as I know, received significant fundamental critiques. And if you look at the pages of some of the leading American newspapers or something, people are grappling with similar problems. And it's striking that it is quite different from the tone of Tobias and Alicia, in the sense that I think there is a sense of a military problem. And time is urgent. Now, that could be wrong, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the Chinese military buildup. And we also shouldn't underestimate that the United States doesn't have the power to do all of these things at the same time. Now, the American political conversation isn't necessarily reflecting that, but I think it's, the Chinese are building, they're going to have 1,000 operationally deployed nuclear weapons by the end of the decade, according to the Pentagon. They're going to have a larger Navy on the current trajectory than we do, not just in the Pacific, but, tout court, right? So this is the reality. And I think what more than anything else, what I hope to do is try to get us, we and our close allies like the UK on the same page. Frankly, my view is that, and I've told this to friends in Whitehall over the last couple of years, I don't think, while I respect the point of the tilt, I don't think that it makes a ton of sense for the UK to allocate a lot of effort into the Pacific. I think what's going to happen is, actually, especially if the Biden administration continues on the current course, there will eventually be a significant potential military vacuum in Europe. And the Russians, of course, have invested significant amount of resources and effort into the military buildup, including their conventional forces, which they are exercising now. And the Germans have done nothing. And the French military is not credible in Eastern Europe. The Poles have done a good job. The Finns have done a good job. But, there's a lot. And what I fear, actually, I imagine the Russians may anticipate that eventually there will need to be a reconciliation between, rapprochement would be a better term, between the United States and Russia vis-a-vis China. If China continues to grow in power, there will be a Nixon to China moment in some way or another, because Russia will have to protect itself. But even if that's the case, maybe they'll get while the getting's good before that happens, and we all have to swallow what happens. So what's critical is the US can't continue to play the role that it has in the post-Cold War period, let alone the Cold War in Europe, which is not the primary theater. That creates a vacuum. The Europeans need to step up, and I think the United Kingdom can play a particularly critical role particularly in combat power. I would not get too focused on gray zone. The Germans have been delinquent, and they continue to be, and unfortunately under the current government, it's probably likely to be worse. But I think there will be a gap over the next 10 years or so that's created. In fact, I mean, just to be clear, and I've said this publicly, even if the Russians go first in Europe, I think the United States will have to withhold significant forces to deter a Chinese move on Taiwan, because that is our priority scenario, I think, and needs to be. And the administration, for its rhetoric, I don't know, the defense establishment in the United States is focused on China, China, China. We'll see what their national defense strategy says. Should come out in the coming weeks or months. But I think that's the most, it seems to me, a role the United Kingdom can play in Europe. I know it's in some intention with some of the recent moves in British foreign policy, but from our point of view, from a macro point of view, I think where we're going to be invested is the Asian states. The most important US ally right now is Japan, because it's the strongest ally. It's located in the key region. It's a much larger economy, and it's not pulling its weight. And the Australians are leading the way in terms of investing in collective defense for the Western Pacific. So but Europe is a critical theater. But if we have to make a choice, we have to choose Asia first. And that's, I don't want to have that choice, but I think we need to be, looking at the same set of facts if we're going to address that.
Thank you very much, Elbridge. We have a question from Angus Lapsley, who's a senior official at FCDO. Bridges' book is great and makes a powerful case for defending Taiwan as linchpin of US strategy, but China will compete globally in the Middle East and Africa, even in Europe. How does US counter this? And also a comment to Alicia and Tobias. We may not want a military Cold War too, but China and Russia are preparing for exactly that, with growing focus on nukes and their own expeditionary capabilities. So, Elbridge, if you could answer the question first, and well, then we will look forward to hearing from Tobias and Alicia for their comment.
What a pleasure to hear from Angus, who's a giant brain, and Britain is lucky to have him thinking about these strategic issues. So, look, a great point, and this is something I think that comes up. I am firmly in what you could call the regional camp, because from a deductive point of view, and that ultimately, I think it comes down to the centrality of hard power for coercive purposes. At the end of the day, I think the Chinese are finding out what we have found out, which is that economic leverage is really hard to turn into decisive political effects. I mean, we've had an embargo on Cuba for 60 years and have nothing to show for it, basically. Look at North Korea, North Vietnam, even Iran, right? China is a huge economy, but it's not working against Australia. It's backfiring. Same with India, that's kicked out many Chinese companies. So I think what this means is that if China is going to get dominant, if its goal is global preeminence, the place to start is in its own region, because that's going to be 50% of global GDP. If they're dominant in Asia, everything else will follow. Africa will not be an independent, or South America will not be an independent source of power to take on the Chinese. It's like Europe in the old days, right? I mean, if the Germans were able to, or the Soviets were able to get dominant there, they could project power outward from there. And that's the critical thing. And what I worry about with the global thing, particularly in the military context, is that we will take our eye off the ball. We'll win a battle in a secondary theater, but we'll lose the fight, in maybe coercive or other, not an actual war, in the primary theater. So the global piece is right. And I also think, and this is a critique I have of the current administration on this, is there's a lot of this, Tobias mentioned the G7. I mean, a G7 statement on Taiwan or something like that, or norms, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, if the Chinese go for it, I think that's going to be pretty hollow. And we have to think realistically about what's going to happen. And so, taking victory laps because we've had an EU statement on Taiwan, I'm not saying it's bad. But I'd rather that we speak a little bit more softly and carry a big stick in the local theater. And the administration a little bit is doing the opposite. And that worries me.
Thank you. Alicia.
Thanks so much. And hi, Angus. Declaration, Angus and I worked together a long time ago. I think on Taiwan, it's a really difficult one. I think deterrence diplomacy very much plays into this, and actually Parliament will hopefully be having a 3-hour debate about Taiwan in about a month that I've just secured. And whilst Elbridge rightly says that doesn't necessarily mean that much, it is about the mother of all Parliament saying that we're watching, that it matters to us, and that our eyes very much on Taiwan. I think it's really interesting that when you negotiate with China, when you talk to China, it's very much about focusing on their history and recognizing that you have taken the time to respect their past, that you are not trying to humiliate them again, which is the kind of core narrative and feeling that I think you approach when it comes to Chinese diplomacy. And the fact is, Taiwan doesn't feature in China's history until the Ming Dynasty. It didn't really care about Taiwan until you had Chiang Kai-shek wanting to run away and hide there and hide out from everything that was going on. And so I think it's really important in negotiations and in discussions about it, we don't just say, well, you can't have it and it's not your right. But actually, we should be ready to get into the depths of Chinese history on this and discuss it with them and show that we respect them enough and respect their history to want to have that discussion. Because the problem at the moment with China is that we are entering into this truly aggressive dialogue, and there is always division without dialogue. It's a fundamental. And I think with the Chinese, we just need to walk that back a little bit. But yes, militarily wise, yes, of course, the Chinese are militarizing. We have to be very smart. We have to pay attention to that. We have to protect ourselves. I think Taiwan, we have a fundamental duty to stand by and support them. But I think we haven't even really got a dialogue going with China on Taiwan that's sensible. And I will put my hands up to this. It's very difficult when you're doing a media op-ed or an interview to go into the depths of the history of Taiwan and China and show the Chinese that you want to have a respectful discussion about this. But yes, fundamentally, I think China is not ready to invade Taiwan. They will not take Taiwan now, but if they do it, I agree with Elbridge in his book, it will be quick, it will be fast, and they will do it. And it is an all-out, they will either achieve it or not, and they must win, and they are not in a place to do so as yet. So we have a fundamental role to make sure that we prevent that, and as I said, operate deterrence diplomacy and prove that concept can be effective.
Thank you, Alicia. Tobias?
Yeah, I mean, just following on from Alicia there, I think it's a really powerful point to make. When we have debates on either Russia, China, or indeed foreign policy, it's rather shocking, actually, perhaps as to the limits of understanding as to what we're talking about. I'm breaking probably things you're probably already aware of, but you get handouts given to you by the Whip's office of questions to ask the minister. And that isn't the way we should be doing these things. We should absolutely learn to understand our competitor and the competitor's history. Most people, I don't think, would be aware as to how we came about to running Hong Kong in the first place. The Opium Wars, the century of humiliation, all about the Middle Kingdom, even Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan. These are all critical if you dare to want to advance a conversation with China. They understand our history. We've forgotten about theirs, and yet, you know, they are still angry by how we, our predecessors, treated that part of the world. And so I think Alicia makes a very, very powerful point. But I just want to build on Eldridge's point as well, which is to do with alliances, because you need to get your own house in order. AUKUS was mentioned, and this is an interesting procurement alliance. But for me, the more beneficial, the wiser, more powerful coalition would be those three nations, along with India and Japan. So the Quad being expanded out to look at strategic thinking and then military support in defending freedom of the seas in the South China Sea. What we've done in the manner that we've rolled this out is just to annoy France, and that takes us neatly to European friendships and politics and so forth, which we know is a bit bumpy, the patch we're going through right now. You know, France and Britain are the most powerful nations in Europe. You put us two together, you get half of the military capability in Europe. But, you know, the relationship is not good. You know, and needs to strengthen, and it gets exploited. Again, this is where Russia is very, very good at doing this, is taking advantage. It's not helped by energy and gas and you know, the other aspects of European lack of European strategy on that front as well. And my final point was just to do with Russia and perhaps looking to turn it 180 degrees, because if we are saying that this is likely to be China's century, you know, they're going to grow, arguably challenge the United States militarily, economically, technologically this century in their dominance, then that is going to be tougher if Russia and China cozy up together. Now, would Russia, the people of Russia, prefer to look west rather than east? I think they would, but you need a graceful platform to off-ramp to allow that to happen. And right now, we're just bumping into each other in Brussels, having arguments over Ukraine, which is not taking us the right way. This is all long-term stuff, but we're not thinking, we're not horizon planning in this way to look as to where not just European security is going, but indeed global security is going over the next 10 to 20 years, which is why Eldridge's book on China and Alicia's concerns about understanding China are so important.
Thank you, Tobias. I see here a slightly provocative question from Benjamin Tallis, who is a fellow at the Harty School in Berlin. He is posing this question: interesting to hear Tobias Ellwood's praise for both Elbridge Colby's analysis and for a liberal worldview. Rather than being complementary, they seem to be contradictory in many ways, not least with regard to the spheres of influence, but also with regard to the role of values in foreign policy and strategy. It would be very interesting to hear from the speakers reflecting on this tension and how it could be productively resolved. Elbridge, would you like to take this?
Sure. I mean, I think, I'm not a liberal. Well, I mean, I'm sort of a classical liberal, I guess, in some context, but I'm not a liberal in the international relations sense, certainly. And so, but that said, one thing I've seen, I was very out of the mainstream in a sense during like the 2000s when, I'd say kind of hawkish liberalism was in the ascendancy. But the kind of hawkish liberal and neoconservative view and the realist view, kind of conservative realist view, have tended to collapse or conflate because the China threat is a threat from a power point of view, but it's also obviously an ideological threat. Now, in terms of the approach, if you're more of a dovish sort of or soft kind of power focused liberal, then there's differences because you are more concerned. I mean, and I think the Biden administration reflects this. It's sort of like the soft power liberalism approach. It tends not to focus on the military as much. It tends to focus a lot more on symbols and these kinds of things, and an alliance of democracies, for instance, which I think is actually counterproductive often in the critical theater. I mean, if you listen even to the Australians, they are saying don't emphasize this, and so that causes tensions. But I would say that, I mean, the China challenge is a bit overdetermined. So I mean, some of these debates are there's plenty of room for agreement. If I could, Victoria, I saw one other point from that I wanted to address from a gentleman named Drew. That was, I really thought, if I could just kind of conflate it, he said, I'm talking about how there is a shift towards the China focus, and yet at the same time in the United States, there's still this focus on the Ukraine and Iran and Europe and Iran, and I think this is a serious challenge. So I think that the scale, the understanding of how much of a threat China is definitely sinking in. I was at the Reagan National Defense Forum a couple months ago, and Reagan Forum did a poll which showed dramatic increase in the perception of China as a primary threat, even over the last year. In fact, I think in particular, Democrats have moved much more into that category, partially because of how the Biden administration is related to China, probably. At the same time, there's still this overhang of this kind of unipolar overhang. I think the newer generation of, I mean, I can speak more about Republicans. I mean, I think the newer generation of Republicans are much more, in fact, I would say there's a strong tendency to want to not get involved at all in the kind of at the grassroots level. So what I worry about is two things. One, that we may not be get to prioritize sufficiently in time, given China's incentives to move in the near term. We may still think that we're the global hegemon, acting like we're the global hegemon, like we can fight all these wars all over the place and no problem, we'll still be able to handle the Chinese before we make hard choices. And the second point is, politically, especially if we continue in that direction, we continue the forever wars and so forth, we're probably more likely to precipitate a come home America movement, not just on the left, but on the right. So what I'm trying to do, in a sense, domestically, to get to this gentleman's very good question, is I think there's a via media. There's a middle way, which is not the crazy, to John Bolton, lunacy of we're hegemon everywhere. And I mean, that's in a sense, he and that ilk are so responsible for the sorry position that we're in right now. But on the other hand, not doing, the Rand Paul, pull back from everywhere, because that's not in our interests and so forth. I don't need to belabor here. But I think in a sense, I do worry politically, we may even, we might be too slow. And on the other hand, we may just pass right by that middle way. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do. I mean, I'm a structural thinker in the sense I look at international politics, but policy decisions matter, personalities matter. It's going to matter who the Republican candidate in 24 is. It's going to matter who the majority leaders are, et cetera. And that's, that's one of the reasons I'm not only writing for an academic audience here, I'm also writing in places like the Wall Street Journal and National Review, because I want to make the case in a way that's politically credible at home.
Thank you. And Tobias?
Yeah, I mean, this question on strategy, my concern, I think what does unite us on this panel is perhaps we just need to do it better. We need to, in this fast changing world, normally there's time to adapt, time for policy to keep up, time for culturally us to become aware of the norms and so forth. But at the moment, things are moving so fast that we're almost unable to react in time. We pick up something, British foreign policy is in that position. Something happens in Hong Kong, we react rather than having a policy which is going to affect China's behavior. We sent the aircraft carrier down across the South China Sea, but is that going to change China's own approach to how it's trying to dominate that bit of maritime space? I think what I'd like to see more of is firstly a rising level of education in the decision makers on both sides of the Atlantic, and then lean into the fast changing world, because it's been said there's a 1930s feel to the world at the moment. weak international institutions, nations rearming, authoritarianism on the rise, and the West unable to sort of have a sort of cohesive view. To add to that, you could also say it's more complicated. Climate change is going to present a whole new dynamic to security. The scale of migration that's going to come from Africa over the next couple of decades is going to be on a biblical level. They really are, as areas become unworkable to live in. And then, of course, we've got extremism, which even 20 years after 9/11, we still haven't managed to harness a way to prevent people from being lured, indoctrinated into extremism. So we have some big challenges ahead of us, and it's going to require some strong leadership. And that really, we're the countries represented here in this panel. It's Britain and America that normally the world looks to in when leadership's required.
Thank you very much, Tobias. We're almost out of time, but I would like to just pose two final questions. So the first one to Alicia from Greg Stevens, who's Royal Marines Reserve, but speaks here in his personal capacity. So he asks the following question. The United States may have far more consideration of geopolitical strategy in its public discourse than does the UK. Recognizing that people on this call may not be representative of the wider population, how might leaders' endeavours in the UK bring such matters up the agenda? Should that in itself lead to a better strategy? And also, might evolution of some policy areas currently dealt with at Westminster be a means of doing so?
So I have to start by pushing back slightly, and I apologise. I'm not trying to say who's more shit than the other, but I would fundamentally challenge the idea that in America, the average discourse on foreign policy is more advanced than that of the UK. I'm really sorry. Having lived in New York for a year or so, from my previous experience, having spent 2 years growing up in an American school, that's not necessarily my experience. But what I can say is the issue across the board is that goes back to almost what I said earlier, which is that governments across the world have infantilized their publics when it comes to national security and foreign affairs. We have said for the last forever that essentially, don't worry, foreign policy and national security is too complicated for you. It's too sensitive. We don't want to worry. You just trust us. We've got it under control. And that is a fundamental problem, because when you look at what drives people's everyday behavior, what the most fundamental concern of every single person on this earth is, it is their own personal security. Am I safe? Are my family safe? Do I have a roof over my head? Human security is our foremost preoccupation as human beings. And yet governments have said, we're not going to educate you about the threats you face, and we're not going to inoculate you against those aggressions coming in, and we're not even going to talk to you in an open way about what they are. So for example, when I led some of the counter-Daesh work at the Foreign Office, one of the things that the former Prime Minister David Cameron absolutely rightly said was, well, one part of the strategy that's missing is an entire pillar of activity solely dedicated to keeping the British public informed and on board about what was going on. Now, that was fundamentally right, because if we hadn't, we would have been forgetting the fact that we have to keep people on board and wanting them to do it. Gone are the days where the UK public will stand by, or any public, and accept while their country goes to war with another, having not made the case or explained it. I've spent the last few months fighting to try and increase awareness amongst the public about what's going on in Bosnia, and I will keep on doing so. And it's very hard to, because foreign policy is often seen as an add-on to politics. Why does Alicia spend her time talking about foreign policy? Foreign policy is fundamental to our security. It's not a side piece, as we've seen, I think, with Afghanistan. So I would fundamentally like to see governments invest in educating people. I would like to see them fundamentally invest in inoculating them. And I think that starts within our school system with critical thinking, and spending more time not studying the Second World War and studying the Tudors and studying the Egyptians, which are all important perhaps for younger ages, but actually looking at the threats we face in the system and how the world currently functions.
Thank you, Alicia. And the final question is from our co-founder and director of research, James Rogers, who's specializing in British strategy. And he's very keen to ask the following question, Elbridge. What would a British strategy of denial look like?
That's really interesting. Well, thanks very much for the question. It's great to be here with you. I mean, I think what's interesting about Britain, actually, I talked to Angus about this in the past, that Britain is a little bit of a it's in tension with my sort of realist look at the world, because Britain does try to punch above its weight. It does try to contribute to collective goals, and I think it should be applauded and lauded for that. It's not just kind of selfishly free riding, because it is in a very secure position relative to, say, Poland or Taiwan or South Korea. I think, what Britain can best do is contribute to a strategy of denial on behalf of these key alliances, where it is best able to do so, and where its interest. I mean, to Alicia's point, dealing with the British populace, and of course I defer to her and Tobias on how best to do that. But I mean, it strikes me that where you're most likely to kind of get resonance is probably in Europe, maybe the Near East, but that if Britain can lead, say in the NATO context, collective efforts to deter Russian misadventures or invasion, even a fait accompli attempt in the East, in targeted investments in hard power capabilities. Obviously, sea and air and cyber and space are British strengths, but also limited ground capacity where Britain has high quality forces. I mean, Tobias is an army officer, but working with the Poles, maybe the Finns, and others, I think Britain can really punch above its weight, and I think would play a critical role. So that's sort of my idea of denial. In terms of the Pacific, I mean, I think things like AUKUS are very effective and promising in the sense that Britain can help contribute to sort of pools of capacity in R&D and technology development, potentially munitions development, which are very expensive and long lead times, alongside Australia, Japan. I personally wouldn't advocate, well, it's not my business to advocate, but I wouldn't suggest that Britain make a major military effort in the Far East, because I think it's going to be very stressing. It's going to be very expensive, and the ultimate output would be relatively limited. I think we're better off kind of focusing where our respective strengths are, and trying to align to that. The one final point I'd make about Tobias and history and Alicia, I really agree. I think Tobias, I think you may have lived in Hong Kong too, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, I'm glad that Britain is taking a more sort of a tougher line on China in recent years, because I agree with Tobias that, I mean, the Chinese have an acute sense of history and the century of humiliation. I remember actually I was in Hong Kong for the handover, and I remember I went to the theater and I saw a movie on the Opium Wars. They remember, and I'm sure Xi Jinping remembers. So the villains of the century of humiliation are not just Japan and the United States, but of course Great Britain as well. So we're in it together. Let's stick together. And I think, of course, I'm so pleased and privileged to be on this session with two leading foreign policy voices and thinkers in the UK, and of course in with you too, Victoria. So thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists and to all our attendees. It's unfortunately already 1:35 p.m. and we need to end our event. And today we had a wonderful opportunity to hear from Elbridge Colby, the Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood, and Alicia Kearns. I would like once again to thank everyone for their important contributions. And we also have some good news. After the event, our Policy Relations and Events Coordinator, John, will share a discount code and information about Elbridge Colby's newest book. So please make sure you monitor your mailboxes and get a copy of this brilliant book after the event. We will be bringing, of course, many more interesting discussions on geostrategic issues and environmental security matters, and you can check the upcoming events on our website, www.geostrategy.org.uk, and you can also subscribe to our events on our website. Thank you so much once again for taking part, and see you next time.
Thank you.